Is all exposure great exposure? Should you say yes to every podcast interview? Hi, this is Tom Schwab with Interview Valet, and I get asked this question often. In some ways, I look at it and say, don't do what I did. You see, I've been on over 1,200 podcast interviews over the last 7 years. Early on, I said yes to everything. Now, while it helped me learn, I hope that you learn from my mistakes. Now, where you get seen is important. And today, more than ever, it's important. If you ever Google yourself now, you'll find that when you Google your name or your company name, often the last podcast appearance shows up. And that can either make you look good or make you look bad. Now, let me give you an example here. Say you're a consultant and you've got an engagement, typically five-figure engagement, right? And somebody is considering you, they Google your name, and then they find you on a podcast that maybe you're not proud to be on. So I call them Wayne's World podcasts, right? Two guys in their mom's basement. Maybe you're trying to close a big deal, and all of a sudden they Google you and find you on the Stoner Brothers podcast. Now, that's not consistent with your brand. It doesn't make you look good. So one of the things that I would always say is make sure that whatever podcast you're on, if your next client, if your next prospect found you on that, would that help your chances or hurt your chances? And there's a lot of times where we talk with people on this, and they'll say, "I want to go on this podcast here." I can think of someone that said, "I want to do 100 podcasts in the month of June." Well, instead of doing more podcasts, why don't you do better podcasts? And how are you going to re-promote? How are you going to repurpose all of that content? So instead of doing more podcast interviews, do more with those podcast interviews. Let me give you a couple of examples here where people have come to us and they said, "Hey, should I be on this podcast here?" One was they came to us and this was a faith-based charity. And they found this podcast and they thought, this would be great. And I pointed out to them, did you realize that's an explicit podcast? And they're like, no, what's that mean? I'm like, well, it's got a little E in it, means that they could swear in it. Now, nothing against that. I mean, that's fine, right? I've got no problem with that. But if you were on that podcast, how would your board like that? Would your funders, the people that are funding you, would they be consistent with that? Would they be comfortable with that? So just because you were invited on that doesn't mean that you want to be seen on that. Another one, a client came to us and they were looking to go public. So this company, their CEO was out there talking about their brand, talking about the category, all the rest of this. And like all of our clients, we do a walkthrough interview before they get out there. And they know their content. It's really not for that. It's really just so that I can get on with them, show them all the resources, all the prep we give them for every interview, and answer any questions. And I'll never forget this client came up and he said, "Hey, my secretary likes this podcast." She says, "It's called Joe Rogan. Have you ever heard of it? Would I be good on that?" And I had to laugh because this was just after Elon Musk was on it. And I said, "I wouldn't put you on that podcast." And he said, "Well, why not? My assistant, she said it was great." I said, "Oh, don't get me wrong. It is a great podcast, but you've got to understand the host of it is a professional comedian. That could be an awkward place for the CEO of a company that's trying to go public." And I said, Elon Musk was on there recently, and I said it was a live interview, and Joe Rogan took a joint. He took a hit off of it and passed it to Elon. Right now, it was legal in California, no problem with that. But I said it impacted their stock price. I said, would you be okay if something like that happened on an interview? He just looked at me and said, "That's why I hired you to pick podcasts and not my assistant to pick podcasts." Another one is we had a client that worked with us, and Carrie is just a sweet, sweet lady, and a Southern lady, and she always felt bad about asking or telling people, no, I don't want to be on your podcast. So whenever she was asked to be on a podcast, she would always say, I would love to, but I don't control my schedule on that. Reach out to Interview Valet, and we would look at that podcast and we would vet it. And it's like, is this one that would be good for her to be on right now? Maybe they were new. Maybe they were just starting out. And the truth is that most podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. So you're just wasting your time if you spend an hour of your time being on the podcast and it doesn't even go live, or it goes live and then they stop paying the hosting bill. So we would always look at it. And if it was one of those new podcasts, we may say, she's not available this quarter. Could you reach back out in 90 days, right? Because in 90 days, they probably had more of an audience, or the truth was that a lot of the podcasts didn't even exist 90 days later. So while exposure is a great thing, make sure that it's the right exposure. The exposure brings opportunity. Make sure it's the right opportunity. So if you want to know more about how we pick a podcast, the algorithm that we use, there's also a video on that. I'll put the link at the end of this. What you have matters. What you could help a whole lot of people. It could change the world. Make sure you're using the best resources of your time and your talent to reach the right people.